As I've mentioned before, speaking of the school year, I can't seem to help but think like a teacher. And that means that I think in terms of courses and classes. So in this setting, that means I think in terms of sermon series and sermons. And so here we are at the beginning of a new school year, and sure enough, I'm introducing a new course. But before I introduce this year's sermon series course, a quick reminder of our previous two courses, which I think do actually lead into this one, but not all of you have been here for the last 3 years. So let me save you some time, and I'm going to summarize those 3 years in about 3 minutes. The rest of you who have been here, think about how much time you could have saved if you just knew. When I first arrived here, I began a sermon series that lasted 2 years. We talked about how the Bible is not a book, but many. It's a library. And in this biblical library are many different kinds of books. And different kinds of books need to be read differently, just like in our modern libraries today. And after all, we do this sort of thing all the time in our lives. We adjust our expectations depending on what kind of book we've picked up, depending on what kind of movie we're watching, depending on who we're talking to. And once we calibrate our minds like that, we can tune in better and pick up more on what the authors or the movie makers are trying to say. Doing that with the Bible is what the first sermon series was about. And another important idea in that series was that we should start with questions like, what did this mean then and there? What did this mean in its original context? How would the original ancient listeners have understood this? And the purpose of that was to decenter ourselves from the discussion and open us up to the possibility of being surprised and learning something new. Then last year, we had a sermon series on what we called the wisdom approach to reading the Bible, as opposed to the rule book approach. We explored the ideas that the Bible is ancient, ambiguous, and diverse. It's ancient. The literature in the Bible comes from a collection of cultures a long, long time ago. So we have to ask ourselves, what translates from those ancient cultures to ours, and what doesn't? It's ambiguous. Even if you go to the basic 10 commandments and you pick one, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, even that does not arrive complete with its own detailed instruction manual. So we have to ask, what constitutes Sabbath? How exactly do we keep it holy? It's ambiguous. So the people of God have been asking questions for 3,000 years, trying to figure it out. The Bible is diverse. Quite often we find different and even, sometimes, conflicting instructions in the Bible. So we have to ask which of these instructions is better matched to our current situation. And so often we found, with all of these things, we find ourselves saying things like, well, it depends. Taking a scientific, logically coherent, unchanging rulebook approach to the Bible just does not take into account the realities of ancient, ambiguous, and diverse. We found that we need flexibility, we need wisdom. So that's the past 3 years. Just like that. Notice that in all that I just described, the overarching value, I hope this comes through, is that we're aiming to take the Bible seriously as we find it, not as we wish it. When we worked through all of those literary genres in the biblical library, when we asked ourselves what the original listeners would have heard, we were doing the work to enter into the world of the Bible as we find it. We asked, what kind of literature is this? Not, what kind of literature do I think it is? Not, what kind of literature do I want it to be? And when we took seriously the idea that the Bible was ancient, ambiguous, and diverse, we once again decentered ourselves, setting aside our cultural preference for this is what we want, scientific, logically coherent rule book. That's what we want. But we set that aside to engage with the Bible as it is, not as we wish it would be. That's the overarching value, taking the Bible seriously as we actually find it. And so far, that's been a pretty positive exercise. However, if we're really going to take the Bible seriously as we actually find it, that also means being honest about what we find in the Bible. And so far, we've been working on making the accessible parts of the Bible more accessible. We've been clearing up some of the ancient and gently puzzling passages. But the reality is, there are also some genuinely upsetting and even disturbing passages in the Bible. It's in there. Not that you'd know that if you grew up in certain church traditions, or if you find yourself anywhere Christian merch is sold. Our tendency, perhaps more in North America than elsewhere, I don't really know, but our tendency is to domesticate the Bible. We make it nice. We can send Christian graduation cards that say, I know the plans I have for you. Plans to give you a future and hope. But there's no indication on that card that the whole point of that passage in Jeremiah is to tell the Israelites who were in exile not to hope for any rescue anytime soon. 70 years they'll have to wait, says Jeremiah. So give up and settle in. You're in exile for the rest of your lives, basically. Happy graduation. We can also buy Christian coffee mugs that say, God's mercies are new every morning. But again, there is no indication that this is basically the only positive statement in the entire book of Lamentations, whose true spirit is more accurately captured by this. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, God dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without any help. Good morning. Put that on your mug if you're not a morning person. We can buy Christian baby clothes that say, I praise you because you knit me together in my mother's womb. But there's no hint that later in that very same psalm, it says, God, if only you would slay the wicked. Do I not hate those who hate you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Aw, cute baby, love the fit. But if we're going to take the Bible seriously, we cannot domesticate it. Taking the Bible seriously means taking it all seriously, in all of its wildness. I want to say something that I hope you absorb. Taking the Bible seriously does not necessarily mean taking it all literally. It does not necessarily mean taking it all instructionally. We need wisdom here. Instead, taking the Bible seriously means looking at even the upsetting and disturbing passages and asking a question actually that Andrea asks over and over again at our staff meetings, and it has helped me grow a lot as a person. It's this: what can we learn from this? So the disturbing passages, what can we learn from them? How do they help us see the bigger picture? Thought experiment. Imagine that you write a novel a novel about suffering and struggle and the challenge of overcoming genuinely difficult obstacles. Now, your novel is not all bleak and difficult. There are restful moments that radiate beauty precisely because of the overall context of the honest and gritty storyline. And now imagine that you give your novel to some friends you care about deeply. They read it, and then they get together with you to discuss the book. But all they talk about is the restful parts. They just love how comforting it is. They keep quoting just the restful parts to each other. Some of them have even made cards and mugs and baby clothes. I think you get what I'm saying. The truth is that the Bible has plenty of moments that don't qualify as precious moments. Here's an uplifting list for you. Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his own son Isaac. This is a command that Abraham begins to obey. And somehow, in God's eyes, that's a good thing. So God takes the command back. What? Many Israelite men in the Old Testament have multiple wives and concubines. And we're talking about big names like Abraham and Jacob and David and Solomon. What does that mean for those who keep pushing biblical family values? God unleashes 10 plagues on the Egyptians in the process of setting the Israelites free, but Pharaoh would have let them go sooner. We're told that it's God who hardens Pharaoh's heart so he can get through all 10 plagues. I mean, once you write down a to-do list, you gotta finish. When the Israelites do escape Egypt and finish their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and finally get back to the promised land, God seems to instruct them to basically commit genocide against the people groups living there. There are also some pretty brutal punishments for breaking weird laws. In Leviticus, for example, always a safe go-to for weird laws. In Leviticus, we read that if a priest lets his hair become unkempt, he will die. And God will be angry with everybody. So, you're welcome, is all I'm saying. In the New Testament, we're familiar with many of the parables that Jesus told, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. Basically, we're familiar with the parables that translate well into Sunday school lessons. Be nice, kids. But there are some other parables that are real doozies. And some of them seem kind of harsh, and it's genuinely difficult sometimes to understand what the meaning is supposed to be. In other places, it seems that some New Testament writers think that the purpose of the crucifixion of Jesus was so that God could finally punish someone for all of our sins, once and for all, and then he wouldn't have to keep on going punishing us, which is tiresome. It's as if God has an anger management issue and needs an outlet. Slavery shows up in both the Old and the New Testaments. Sometimes it seems to be resisted and undermined. Other times it seems it's just accepted as the way things are. Women are not always treated very well. It's true, they are sometimes leaders. Women are sometimes leaders in both the Old and the New Testaments. But other times, there seems to be instruction that a woman should never speak in church. And then, of course, there's that pesky little lake of fire in the book of Revelation, leading some to talk about eternal torment for those who oppose the loving God. That stuff is all in there. So, and I'm sure you could add to the list. Actually, some of these things are emails from you, some of you, who have written in to say, what's going on here? So if we're going to take the Bible seriously as we actually find it, the question is, what are we going to do about these disturbing things? Are we going to ignore them? Are we going to keep clinging to a domesticated Bible? Are we going to keep buying and selling cards and mugs and baby clothes? The precedent has been set. This is a well-worn path. Or are we actually going to face these difficult things? And if that's what we decide to do, and that is what I've decided to do, how in the world are we going to do that? Well, that's basically the theme of this series for this year. Now, can a sermon series like this be anything other than depressing? Can it be inspiring? Can it be uplifting somehow? I don't know. Will this be the end of my pastoral career? Maybe. But we're going to try anyway. I want to go back to teaching for just a moment. In the world of education in British Columbia, every course has to have a document that lists the big ideas of the course. You know about, yes. Recently, Becky and I had to write so many documents about so many courses and so many big ideas, and one can grow weary. Well, Becky, I'm sorry to report that for the remainder of this sermon, I'm going to outline 7, and don't worry, some of them are quite short, 7 of the big ideas that will come up in this sermon series in this upcoming year as we explore the more difficult parts of the Bible. So here we go. First, big idea. Life itself is undomesticated. It's beautiful sometimes. It's really rough sometimes. And even though we try to fence it in and tame it, life is wild. When we take the Bible seriously as it actually is, when we really look at all of it, we find that the Bible, like life, is undomesticated. And that's comforting in an odd sort of way, because it means that we are not called to live up to some artificially sweetened, happy or very happy ideal. In the Bible, we see powerful examples of the people of God being, as Pamela put it not long ago, gloriously imperfect. Making mistakes, growing, regressing, growing some more, regressing again. Growing and learning, in other words, in the same rough way that we do. Second big idea. We need to remember that not everything in the Bible is there to be imitated. There are obvious examples of this, like the David and Bathsheba story, but there are subtle examples too, and that requires wisdom, thought, discernment, critical thinking. Critical thinking, by the way, doesn't mean put downs, it means making a good judgment. Slight detour. About 20 years ago, I took a philosophy course on the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. The course was taught by Jan Zwicky, who was and is an amazing human being. Not only was she a powerful philosopher and teacher, she was also an acclaimed poet. At the time that I took the course, she had already won a Governor General Award for poetry. Since then, she's been shortlisted 2 more times for both nonfiction and for poetry again. And she's also an accomplished violinist specializing in Baroque music. Anyway, in this course, she said something that I will never forget. Plato, as you may know, wrote dialogues instead of essays. They read like the scripts of plays, with different characters having different personalities and different views. Usually Socrates is the main character, and we're often led to believe that his views are what Plato is putting forward as the main point. But as Jan Zwicky pointed out to us, sometimes the arguments Socrates makes are kind of weak. And the other characters don't notice. They agree with Socrates, saying things like, yes, that's obvious now that you say it like that, Socrates. But it's not obvious because it's a bad argument. And she said to us, this is no mistake. Plato was very, very smart. It's not as if he didn't notice that the arguments were weak. He made them weak on purpose and had the other characters agree too easily on purpose so that we, the listeners, would get caught by the discussion and want to jump in, saying, no, it doesn't work, and here's why. And she said, the moment we get caught like that, Plato has worked his magic. Because now his work of philosophy is not something dead on paper. It's still alive as we enter into it and keep the discussion going. This is not a perfect analogy, but here's my point. Perhaps one good reason for the unsettling things we should not imitate, perhaps one good reason for those things to be in the Bible is so that we too can get caught by them and enter into the very alive, still going biblical story as we say things like, no, that doesn't work, and here's why. Perhaps some things are in the Bible not to be imitated, but to provoke us, to spark reflection and deeper thinking. Third big idea. This is an obvious one. The ancient cultures of the Old and New Testaments were very different than ours. It's obvious, but too often we overlook it. If God were to waltz in here and start talking, I think we can agree it would be in a language that we could understand. The examples and the ideas and the images God used would be within our cultural framework. Why? So that we could understand God. And even if God's eventual goal were a radical change of our cultural framework, the start of the lesson would still be within our culture, so that we could understand it. Now that's just a guess, but it's a pretty good guess because that's exactly what we see in the Bible. Emmanuel, God with us, is found throughout the Bible. It's not just at Christmas time. When God begins communicating with the Israelites, it's within the already existing cultural framework of something called a covenant. Even though, as the Israelites will eventually come to understand, God's covenant is actually quite different than the typical covenants of the day. But God had to start somewhere. Their understanding of God had to start somewhere. And my point is, we do find things in the Bible that are culturally disturbing. But often, there are things that the Israelites eventually come to understand should be removed from their culture. Fourth big idea. This one is similar to the one about ancient culture, and it's this. The literary practices of the ancient world were sometimes quite different than ours. The way the ancient Israelites wrote history, for example, is not at all like we write history. You will find in the Old Testament, if you take the time to look, 2 complete histories of the Israelite monarchy. The first one is found in the Samuels and the Kings, and the second one is found in the Chronicles. They are not the same. There are what we call discrepancies. There are exaggerations. There are descriptions of events that may or may not have happened. And we get all freaked out. Lies, falsehoods, no academic integrity. But when reading their history, we have to remember to abide by their rules of history, not ours. So, trigger warning. I'm about to make a very strong statement. As always, I may be wrong, but I want to be clear about where I'm coming from. So if you have to, take this very strong statement with a grain of salt the size of Lot's wife. There's another one. Here is my strong statement. If we impose our modern rules of history writing on the ancient Israelites, we are doing two very bad things. The first very bad thing is we are committing basically imperialism. We are imposing our culture at the expense of another. The indigenous culture of the Old Testament is ancient Israelite culture. When reading their literature, respectful engagement means entering into their culture and not wiping it out. The second very bad thing that happens when we impose our rules, our modern rules of history on the Bible, is idolatry, because we are basically remaking the Bible in our image. So we must tread carefully and respectfully when we read ancient literature, being mindful to avoid the dual pitfalls of imperialism and idolatry. Fifth big idea. We see quite clearly throughout the Bible an evolution in the people of God. They grow. Their understanding of God and of what it means to be the people of God, that understanding changes. It matures. Sometimes it undergoes complete revolutions. They go from their God as one God among many to God as the only God, the creator and sustainer of all things. They move from God as a violent tribal God among other violent tribal gods to the God of love who cares most deeply about social justice, to the God concerned primarily not with conquering, as they once thought, but with caring for the vulnerable. A God who says things like, "Love the foreigner in your midst." They move from expecting a Messiah as a warrior who's going to kick some Roman butt to accepting a Messiah who was a non-violent, executed revolutionary. They move from seeing the human world as divided into two categories, Jews versus Gentiles, to seeing the human world as one people, all children of God. There is change. And once you realize this, you also realize that means the beginning parts of that evolution are not necessarily going to be pleasant, not necessarily going to be the examples we should follow. We have an honest and raw and gritty account of their spiritual journey in our Bibles. It's not all held up for us to imitate. It's there to give us a sense of the direction things should be going. Sixth big idea is, this one's closely related, and it's that we need to keep in mind the big picture. When we come across brutal passages in the Old Testament, for example, it's important to remember that those brutal passages do not stand on their own. In the context of the rest of the Old Testament, they are superseded by an emerging understanding of God and culture that rejects that kind of brutality. And if we step back even more in the context of Christianity and the New Testament, those brutal passages in the Old Testament are part of a huge story that involves basically blowing up divisive categories like us versus them, clean versus unclean, important versus disposable. Yes, there are brutal and uncomfortable passages. We're going to be honest about that. But remember, that we don't worship the Bible. We read it. We are shown examples in it, both good and bad. We are provoked by it toward a deeper reflection. It's okay that we don't like everything we find there. I'll say it again, we don't worship the Bible. Instead, we worship what the Bible points us toward. And it points us toward the God of love, especially as seen in Jesus. It's just that sometimes the way the Bible points us in the right direction is by being honest about uncomfortable things. The seventh and last big idea. Strangely enough, I hope, for my future employment, strangely enough, there can be comfort in facing the discomfort. Because what it does is it removes the taboos. No longer will we say, hey, it's all about love and peace, while deep down we're thinking to ourselves that there are some Bible passages we just don't talk about and are too afraid to face like monsters under the bed. But if we have the courage to look under the bed, to talk about everything, there's a whole lot less of, yeah, but in our souls, and a lot more feeling like we're living in reality rather than living in denial. So, that's where we're headed. I hope we'll learn a lot, and despite the potentially depressing material, I hope we'll still somehow find it to be a positive experience. Because the Bible, in its domesticated form, really kind of maxes out at cards and mugs and baby clothes. No matter how hard we try to dress up a domesticated Bible with fancy churches and seminaries and things like this, it just doesn't keep giving. But the Bible, in its undomesticated form, in its wildness, has the power to surprise and shock and revolutionize and inspire us for as long as we're willing to let it. So let's head down this road together with honesty and with courage, confident that the God of love has given us something that is infinitely more than we could ask or imagine. And there's always room to grow. Amen.